Welcome to ScalaUA conference.
There were other tools back in the time when Spark was created, but what makes Spark special is first that it's fast, because unlike some solutions like Hadoop, it tries to keep as much as possible in memory. So this is a picture from Spark documentation, where they picked the case where they performed the best. And Spark has a much simpler API, not like some clumsy MapReduce jobs. It's more like Scala collections API. Here you can see an example of counting occurrences of fruit names in input list. There is a family of Spark products like Spark SQL, Spark streaming. It's not really streaming but micro-batching. Machine learning, ML, and graphics. For graph processing, we'll talk briefly about Spark SQL and mostly about Spark 4. Most of this API is available in Scala, Java, and Python, but Scala API is the richest. Brief history of Spark. Its development started in 2009 in University of California, Berkeley. It was open sourced in 2010. Then in 2013, Databricks company was founded in order to provide commercial support. And at the moment, the latest version of Spark is 2.1. Now we're going to talk about basic building blocks of Spark application, and then we'll go a bit higher to execution model. So the most fundamental building block is RDD, Resilient Distributed Dataset. And in the nutshell, it's something like a Scala collection. It basically can contain any kind of object as long as it can be serialized. What makes RDD special? So it's resilient. When you do transformations on RDD, it keeps history of these transformations. It's so-called legacy. So if some RDD content is lost, it can be recomputed from other RDDs. For example, on this slide, if content of RDD4 is lost, then it's recomputed by recomputing first RDD3 and taking content of RDD2 from the cache. Distributed. RDD content is split into partitions. Partitions reside on different nodes. This way you can store more data than can fit in memory of single machine, and it enables parallel processing. Different machines may process different pieces of the data. Yeah, and sometimes RDD partitions may need to change. This is called shuffling. It's costly operation, but some operations need it. Immutable and lazy. Immutable because RDD API doesn't have any methods for changing the data in existing API. You can only build a new RDD from existing one. And lazy. The transformations that you apply do not trigger calculations immediately. They wait until you call action method. Transformations, they define the relations between RDDs, and actions, they actually trigger the calculation. Here are some examples of transformations and actions. Depending on exact type of data which is stored in RDD, some additional operations may be available. For example, for RDDs of pairs. They behave a bit like Scala maps. They have key and value, so they have methods like map values reduced by key and so on. They are selected in blue here. That's all fine, but how do we create the first RDD to start our transformations? Few examples how it can be done is from Scala collection. You can parallelize it. You can read content of some large files. Then each line of that file will be an entry in RDD. It will be RDD of strings. Or you can read content of some directory. Then each file in this directory will be an entry of RDD. It's also an RDD of strings. With Spark SQL, it's a bit different. The most basic building block is data frame. Data frame is what you will be working with most often. It's essentially a data set of rows. Data set is not RDD here. These are different classes. And for data set it's not enough for class to be serializable in order to be stored in data set. It has to be mapped to some table-like structure, so it's a bit more complex. But this gives Spark more knowledge about your class internal structure, and it can do a lot of optimizations. It can store it in a columnar format, which is more space efficient. It can optimize queries. Other funny things. It's Spark SQL abstractions mostly stick to duck typing. For example, row doesn't check if your columns exist at compile time. It delays it at runtime. Dataset and data frame transformations are a bit more fine-grained than in RDD. Instead of just mapping or filtering complete items, you have methods to add or remove a column, rename column, and so on. There are also more low-level methods like map, but they are they require a bit more work than in RDD. And how do we create the first data frame? One way is if we have an RDD of rows, we can supply a schema for it, and we have a data frame. We can also read it from files, and quite often Spark can derive the schema for us. But in some cases we might want to specify it manually. In previous slides you might have noticed such classes as Spark Context and Spark Session. These are basically entry points to Spark program. Spark Context provides an entry point to Spark Core. And as Spark SQL also uses Spark Core, every Spark program must have a single Spark context. In order to use Spark SQL functionality, you will also need Spark Session. The tricky point is that when you create Spark Session, you cannot provide existing Spark context to it. So the main takeaway point here is if you only going to use Spark Core functionality, you need to create a Spark context. If you're going to use both Spark Core and Spark SQL functionality, you need to create Spark Session and get Spark context from it. Okay, now as we covered basic building blocks, let's talk about execution model. The processes that make up a Spark application can be divided into driver and executor. There is only a single driver. It coordinates all the work. Driver actually builds execution plan. It in Spark SQL it also makes SQL optimization. And executors do the dirty job, transformations, filtering, and so on. Driver is a single point of failure. If your driver dies, your application dies. There are some ways to restore it, but they don't come out of the box. They require some effort from you. And executors are usually safe to kill and create. And executors have task slots. It means that there is fixed number of tasks which executor can execute. The whole processing is divided into jobs, stages, and tasks. Whenever you invoke some action on a RDD or data frame, it is a job. If you want to count a number of items in RDD, it's a job. If you want to get content of RDD, it's a job. Usually you will not see multiple jobs running in parallel because actions are mostly blocking, but in some special situations it's possible. Now the job is divided into stages. The division point is shuffle. Whenever a Spark has to do the shuffle, I remind you, shuffle is when we need to change partition of some RDD. So whenever it has to do a shuffle, it's the boundary of the stage. Stages have some dependencies between them. They make up a graph. And if some stages do not depend on each other, then they may run in parallel. And each stage is divided into tasks. Number of tasks is determined by desired number of partitions in output RDD. And all the tasks of single stage are always independent. They all can run in parallel. Okay, that was execution model. Now, as we want to create actual Spark application, there are a few concerns that we need to keep in mind. So the first concern, do we want a standalone application, self-sufficient, which we can run just with Java, jar, blah, 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 or we are going to submit our jar with Spark submit. There are advantages and disadvantages in both of these approaches. If you have a standalone application, it's easier to run. It may include some web API so that the user can call some REST endpoint and immediately trigger some processing on Spark and immediately get result. But submitting with Spark Submit offers some better resiliency. Next concern is master URL. Master URL is parameter specified either to Spark Submit or when creating Spark context in your standalone application. It defines where will your application run. The available choices are local. Local is just on your machine. It suits only for testing. Of course, it cannot take a lot of load, but it's convenient for when you're testing your application. Then there is a standalone cluster. It's a lightweight kind of cluster which can run on the Spark applications. It can run on Mesos cluster, I have no experience with it, but they say that it offers very fine-grained resource control. That's pretty advanced. And it can run on Yarn cluster. It's a Hadoop cluster, and probably the best thing about Yarn cluster is that it's available on Amazon with a few clicks. So it has really low entry point to set up it. A few words on Yarn cluster. As you might have noticed on the previous slide, master URL for Yarn cluster doesn't include the actual location where to connect. Connection information is provided in additional files, and you need to specify a folder where they are located with Hadoop confdir. Or if you're building a standalone application, you need to pack these files as resources with the application. Amazon EMR, Elastic MapReduce, which is actually a hosted Yarn cluster, offers a nice feature, Step API. It lets you use Spark Submit without installing Spark distribution on your machine. You can just call appropriate endpoint, give it a jar file, and it will deploy it and execute. The drawback of this approach is that only a single step can run at a time on the cluster. Next concern is deploy mode. It can be cluster or client. If you're writing a standalone application, you actually don't have such choice. You have to use client mode. If you're using Spark Submit, you may choose either client or cluster mode. Client mode is when driver runs on your machine, a machine from which you have submitted the application. In this case, you get immediate output from the application. You can control it better, debug it better. But if your machine shuts down, the whole processing shuts down. Remember that driver is a single point of failure. And in cluster mode, cluster takes care of assigning machine for your driver, and you may shut down your computer and your application will still run, but it's a bit more difficult to get logs and see what's going on in your application. In production environments, it's usually preferred to use cluster mode. And the last concern is Spark binaries. Spark Submit takes care that binaries are available on the cluster when you run the application, but sometimes it may lead to unnecessary uploads with each run of your application. If you upload Spark binaries into some globally available place like HDFS or S3, you may make your application run faster. Now, file systems that you may use in your application. Whenever you load or write some files, you may use such file systems. It's the local file system of the node, and in order to use it, the file that you refer should be available at the same location on each node. HDFS, it's a Hadoop distributed file system. Comes in two flavors. If you started with 2 slashes, you need to specify the master host of the file system. If you want to refer to default HDFS of your cluster, you may you should use just a single slash. now HTTPS, HTTP, FTP, it's just download a file from these URLs. With the S3, it's a bit complicated because it differs on Amazon EMR and on all other places. In a nutshell, if you're running on Amazon EMR, you should use S3. Everywhere else, you should use S3A. There is a long history of workarounds, limitations, and so on. So, this is what you should keep in mind. It's diverse. Default file system, that depends on your system setup. If you're running on a yarn cluster, for example, default file system refers to default HDFS. If you're running in local mode, it usually refers to the local file system of your machine. When you're using Spark Summit, the local file system has a bit different meaning. If you write file, then it refers to local file system of your machine from which you're submitting the application. If you want to refer to locations on the nodes of the cluster, you need to use local prefix. Let's talk about some performance considerations. So the first thing is we all have accustomed to use quite high-level abstractions, and but when performance matters a lot, we might need to unlearn this a bit and use integer keys instead of more meaningful strings. Use arrays instead of more convenient sequences and sets. In one case, I observed improvement, four-time improvement after replacing a sequence with array in one RDD. Broadcasts. Broadcasts is a more efficient way of transferring data from driver to executors. You may pack your data into a broadcast, and if it's used in multiple places, it will be uploaded to workers just once. That saves a lot of traffic. Don't use flat map when you need to do filter. I don't know whether someone of you will have such, will try to do such things, but I saw it actually. I saw such attempts. Besides obvious drawback that it's more tedious, there is a hidden one that filter doesn't change the items in RDD. Flat maps changes, so Spark cannot be sure that what you return is what was in input. Therefore, it may lead to unnecessary shuffling in some tricky situations. Sometimes you might need to inspect code generated by a Spark SQL optimizer. There is an API for doing this. Extended to explain tells you the steps which Spark undertaken in order to optimize the SQL, and non-extended just gives you a final result. Joins. Joins are probably the most painful thing in Spark, so the best optimization tip about joins in Spark is try to avoid them. Try to pre-join it in some of the ways, but sometimes you may encounter join in the middle of some more complex workflow where you cannot avoid it. So, who remembers what is the biggest concern when writing a hash method in Java objects? Right. So something similar applies to joins in Spark. In order to do the join, it has to reshuffle both sides of the join by keys which you use in join. And in this example, you can see that K1 is encountered too many times and other values not so often. This means that partitions 2, 3 and other will be processed very fast, and partition 1 will work alone. So no matter how big is your cluster, only one node will be working. In general case, it's a very tricky situation, but in specific cases, you can usually overcome it somehow. So, if you're joining a big RDD or data frame with small, you can use broadcasts. In Spark SQL, there is such a nice way to instruct Spark that hey, this small df is small enough to broadcast it to all the nodes, so don't bother to reshuffle these data sets, just keep the partitioning of big df and send a small df to every partition, and so this works. There might be situations where you have already joins, and one of the sides of your join has a lot of nulls. Then you can split it into two data sets, and for data sets which have nulls in join columns, you can simply substitute nulls on another side, and with the remaining you can safely do the join. If this doesn't help, then there is Sultan, which usually can alleviate your problems a bit. It works especially good if you have pre-skewed one side, and on the other side your keys don't have much values associated with it. We may introduce additional column, L column, and on the big side, on the skewed side, we assign values, in this case from 1 to 3, to the rows, and on the non-skewed side we duplicate the rows with different values of L, and this way we can split one partition into 3 partitions. Then we'll do the join, and after the join it's safe to remove L column, and here it is. Sometimes you may want to tweak partition settings. Spark SQL has a fixed number of partitions after the join. This is not so good situation, but it's how it's implemented now. By default it's 200, so after each join you have 200 partitions. If you're doing unit testing, this is too big, and for actual workloads this is often too small. So there is a Spark SQL shuffle partitions setting, which you might want to tweak in order to fit better the scale of your data. Okay, when we were talking about resiliency of RDDs, I thought that the legacy of RDD is stored. This is the history of all transformations that led to this RDD. This lets RDD to be fault tolerant, but unfortunately it has its cost. From my experience, the cost of SQL optimizer is not linear with grows non-linearly with the size of your transformations graph. So some transformation which is not very heavy at the beginning might eat all the memory of the driver when it's applied after tons of another transformations. In this situation, you might want to use checkpointing. Checkpointing is writing the content of RDD or data frame into durable storage and forgetting its history. So starting from the fresh page. So that SQL optimizer doesn't have to think about previous history. And about durable storage, there are basically two popular choices, either HDFS or S3. HDFS is good because it's vendor neutral, it's available everywhere, but it also has downsides, because if your cluster dynamically changes the size, your nodes come and go, you may end up having data on the small subset of your nodes, and your tasks will not be fairly distributed. S3, on the other hand, has advantage that it's available to any node, so you don't need to care about distribution of data between the nodes. It's equally available everywhere. It's huge, it can handle any size of the data that you want. But it has a few drawbacks as well. First of all, it involves vendor lock-in. You're locked to Amazon. Another issue is that it's eventually consistent. So when you just write to S3, you may not be available to read the same data that you have just written. In order to overcome this, Amazon has some dirty hack named as EMRFS. This is the flag that you may select when creating EMR cluster. And if you are going to write your checkpoints in S3, you must always select it. It basically creates some additional layer between your application and S3, and which checks whether S3 has already written the data that you have told it to write, and if it hasn't yet, it retries and retries until success or exceeding the attempts count. Of course, the first question with the checkpoint data is how to clean them up, because you usually will not want it to be there after restarting the application. And there is an API for cleaning up the data on exit. So it's done through Hadoop file system API. It relies on your driver being alive. So if your application crashes due to some serious issues with workers, it still will clean up the data on exit. And if your driver crashes, it may not always clean up. So you might need some additional mechanism. Okay, done with the performance. I wanted to talk about one life hack about writing the data from executors. Executors don't have direct access to file systems. They cannot directly tell driver to do anything, but there is such a thing as accumulator. Accumulator, it's a way of communicating from
worker to driver. It's basically kind of opposite of broadcast. Accumulator can be written on workers, and driver can read it. But suppose such situation when you want to log some events on executors. There might be a lot of events, and if you use accumulators as recommended, these all events might not fit in the memory until your driver reads them. Fortunately, you may use Amazon SDK API in executors, and if you run it on Amazon EMR, it will actually come pre-configured with credentials. So you can just call default constructor of Amazon S3 client, and whenever your accumulator on some specific executor overfills, you can dump your data on S3. However, need to keep in mind that executor might be restarted, task might be restarted, so entries in your log may be duplicated. But that still should be useful for conveying some debug information. That's basically it. So, any questions?
In the beginning you said that MapReduce is little blunt, but I fully agree, but my question is, I read in the book that Spark was created not for this full replacement, but as a complement of MapReduce. Can you clarify it?
Spark is largely a competitor of Hadoop. It at least promises that it can do anything that Hadoop can. But you know, reality is like something may not be yet covered. But the movement in the direction that Spark can do more and more that Hadoop can.
Have you any experience of using Spark SQL with BI tools such W or so on? And what about a lot of parallel queries in Spark SQL? Is it create huge impact on performance or no? So what about if a lot of Spark SQL tasks begin works on clusters?
Sorry, I don't have such experience. Need to check it.
I have a question about maybe you have experience on building systems that will use API to start jobs, Spark jobs. So not user will create these jobs and write, but jobs will be generated by system and started and respond by the REST API.
Yeah, if your jobs are small enough to fit into maybe seconds or minutes, you can use a standalone application and include Spark binaries into your application, run it in client mode, and yes, it is possible. For our application, we have decided that it's not our approach because of weaker fault tolerance. Our jobs are a bit longer. So, yeah.
Is there any way to use cluster from the API?
Yes.
You told us that at the start of your talk that you have experience of learning and using Spark by yourself in your project. Can you tell us some guides on how to start working in production with Spark, how to configure it, maybe what we should look into first, how we should start to build production system, not just playing with the hello world, but work in production.
Of course, it all starts from understanding of your requirements. Will your jobs be long or short? Do you need the result to be retrieved immediately, or you can wait? Like I expressed in 4 concerns. This is the first concern. Whether you should build a self-sufficient application which includes Spark binaries and which triggers all the jobs, or you're going to submit it with Spark Submit. If your jobs are small and you need them to be kind of interactive, you probably should build a self-sufficient application. If your jobs are long, then probably fault tolerance concerns are more important, and you should somehow build on top of Spark Submit. It will require a bit more work from you, but parts of your application then can be independently shut down and enabled again. For example, your web part can be restarted, and jobs which it has triggered will be still running. Does that answer your question?
You said about datasets at the beginning, and it's like was something. It's not like the way in the RDD it's stored in column weight. What does it mean? Because like datasets is more like RDDs but with types. It's wrote it in tutorials. So.
That's what you see as user underlying implementation is a bit more complex. And of course, as far as I understand, somewhere deep inside, data sets still use RDD, but not in that straightforward way. Mapping is more complex.
Like way of these distributed datasets and RDDs in storing is different or not?
Yes, they store the data differently. For example, datasets don't use the serialization method that you configured for Spark Core. They have their own ways of serializing. They claim that it's more efficient. So it's better not to think of datasets as kind of RDDs, but better think of them as a more type-safe way version of data frames.
You mentioned also that joins is not a good practice in Spark. Do you know any other operations we should avoid?
Shuffle is a problematic thing. So all the operations that implemented through the shuffle is they're costly. We should think twice.
So I have a question. So actually, if we, I just wonder, as far as I know, is that whenever we partition the RDDs that we are going to join with the same partitioner, it's often possible to actually have narrow RDD dependencies and to avoid shuffling. Did you have any experience of using custom partitioners for joining and for other optimizations?
No, if you have specific columns with which you need to make a join, there's just no way to avoid shuffling.
Well, actually there is. If you use the same partition with specific partitioners, actually you can do joining without shuffling, and it's a quite common type of optimization actually. Especially when you have your range partitioners.
Well, if you need to join by column A and your data is, and then you need to join by column B, you need to do different kinds of partitioning.
Yeah, in some cases it's not possible. Thank you.
Okay, you can catch me later on this conference. You can, if you think of some other questions. I will be happy to answer them. And please don't forget to vote on the online voting The link is available on the ScalaUA page. So, thank you for attention.
Well, the world is going more global, so nowadays there are more opportunities for developers in small towns than ever, so pay more attention to some remote opportunities to freelance.